So I got a whole bunch of jokes about IT, especially after this morning. But instead I'm going to be even more upsetting for you and incur more hatred by talking about plastics. Do you mind? Is that all right? Still about myths and everything. So just to tell you a little bit about who you want to hate, I'm very pleased to be in Europe. Myself, I'm not that pleased to be in the EU. But on the left here, this is according to Herodotus in 350 years before BC. There's Libya, which Britain has fixed. Saudi Arabia, we're still in bed with them. Persia, don't like them much. India, which we civilized, as we all know. And China's not on the map because it never did anything for world civilization. I used to work at Philips. On the left is Gerrit Philips. He invented the compact disc, the light-emitting diode, lights, and a million other things. They invented everything. They marketed nothing. Why did I have to leave the company? Because these are my colleagues on the right. So I am in forecasting. I did a little book called Why is Construction So Backward? It got me a threatening phone call from this man, so it can't be all bad. And then I did a book called Energize. Couple of booby prizes are here for anybody who likes my speech. If you go to Amazon, it's at the head of a list of books called Energize Your Sex Life. It's got nothing to do with that. So I just want to say a little word about disruption before we get into plastics. Nobody knows any history anymore. Just this morning, The Guardian was attacking somebody whose politics I disagree with, Nigel Farage, for making what it said anti-Semitic tropes about the Bilderberg Group. If you bother to click on that article in The Guardian, they refer you to another article about the Bilderberg Group, which said that it is a global international conspiracy of billionaires and all of that. So if Nigel Farage was anti-Semitic, then so was The Guardian. But they don't know what they wrote a year or two ago, or indeed 10 years ago. They forget what they wrote, and certainly nobody knows what this guy wrote, who's the guy who actually coined the phrase disruption. And if you read that book, which nobody has anymore, you'll find that he does not mean disruption in the sense of a major technological transformation. What he means is disrupting the market. That's a bit different. Nuclear fusion would be technological transformation. Disrupting the market is a very different thing with much reduced ambitions. Reduced ambitions, ladies and gentlemen, that go together with today's animosity towards taking risks. So if you read that book, you'll find that first of all he wants to make innovation more predictable, don't we all? But it's in the nature of innovation that it isn't predictable. Because if we knew what we were doing, as Einstein apocryphally said, it wouldn't be called research. In research, you don't know what's going to happen. In development, you don't know what's going to happen. When you prototype something, you don't know what's going to happen. You are uncertain, and that's the great thing about innovation, that it can also prosper from serendipity, from mistakes like penicillin, and all of that. So to make it more predictable is to try to de-risk it. And the more relevant error that he makes is to say that disruption in his definition is to disrupt the market with good enough technology. Not the best, just good enough. That's a deliberate lowering of horizons. So he would rather you were a Panasonic fast follower to Sony in TVs. Don't make the first innovation. Just do good enough TV and TVs. And the second thing that goes along with that is, you know, you'd rather be a Dell than an Apple. You'd rather just make an inkjet printer and crash the market for laser printers, when you and I know that a laser printer produces a better product, even if it's more expensive. So what I'm trying to say is one needs to forecast the future with a very careful rear view mirror about who said what, when, why, what they meant, and how it's become Baudelarized and mashed up by the media and everybody else since. So that's just by way of introduction, and it's to do with my speech I was going to give on IT, but after today I don't think I'm going to give that. So if we turn now to green matters and plastics, I'm bound to say that the consensus with the new secular saint that's just been established already as a scientist makes me very nervous. When people start talking about the science, rather than science. And they're now saying that there's a 100% consensus in science, the science, on climate change. I can't be on that bus. If you read that book, you'll find that I'm not that term of psychobabble that is usually used against anybody who raises a critical voice. I'm not a denier. I'm not in denial. I'm not a denialist. I believe in anthropogenic climate change. That's one thing. That's what science says. What we do about it is the domain of politics. Science cannot tell us what to do. We tell us what to do. Science is about the natural world. Policy is about the human world. But nevertheless, the unanimity and consensus around plastics and climate change really is quite striking. It embraces not only the United Nations, that well-known force for good, classically efficient and always on the right side of history, but it also embraces the 1,500 private jets people who go to Davos each year. They too have formed a global alliance against plastics, along with the American plastics industry, another notable force for progress. And all that they say is what we heard from the Democratic Party advisors, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, about 2008 in their book, Nudge. They are telling you, or they're nudging you, to recycle that plastics cup. And I'm sure at Ipsos soon, just like at PricewaterhouseCoopers, right now, you will shortly get human resources saying that you can all, if you haven't already got it, human resources will say, as they do at PwC, we've got a whole new mission for PwC now. Will you sort your rubbish and your plastics cups into no fewer than 25 categories, which is what they have at the PwC headquarters. I'm delighted none of you have left yet, but I want to say that another very disturbing feature of this sort of Democratic Party nudging your behaviour, I should put it myself, more like an elbow in the ribs, is something that I spotted about 4 or 5 years ago about the campaigns against fracking, that they are mobilising children who know so much about science, the periodic table and pi to 20 places, that they cannot be disobeyed or disavowed. And that was happening already before the canonisation of Greta Thunberg. Now let me just say that if you want to forecast where plastics and all of this is going, you have to be a little bit conscious of the past, otherwise you're going to repeat it. And one of the striking things about plastics is that hydrocarbons in general, and plastics in particular, reflect very much the society that they're in, the society that Ipsos is so excellent at analysing. So if you go back to the 20s, especially the roaring 20s, you'll see these kinds of movies about oil. Black gold, fantastic, terrific. If you go back to my childhood, which is why I read physics, this is what came out of the Sugar Puffs packets in the 60s. They were plastic astronauts that inspired me to be ambitious, to take risks, to make innovations, to read physics and all of this. I've still got them. If any of you ever need a bed in Putney, you can sleep there and you can admire my astronauts. You'll notice as well that even then, humanitarian intervention in the shape of the United Nations was already sorting out oppressive regimes on the moon and elsewhere. So we thought, and I erred in imagining that plastics was a good thing, right? I know it made me, become the bore I've become now and, do all that physics stuff, but actually it was a good thing. Now, already as you well know, if any of you know your movies, is that already in the 60s, with Mike Nichols' The Graduate, plastics became a sort of byword for everything that was awful. So while I was into the astronauts, a different camp of thought was beginning. And the feeling was that we could not keep up with the speed of development of technology. It's a really amazing thing about IT nowadays. It's moving so fast. In fact, it's moving exponentially. There's exponential disruption, and human beings and the law, society can't keep up with it. Who first thought of that? Anybody know? Jimmy, no. You're an expert? No?
Moore's law.
Sorry?
It's Moore's
law? Yeah, no. If you read Moore's 1965 article, you'll find the word law is not in it. Right? It's not in it. Check it out. It's in electronics. You can easily get hold of it. But you're on the case. Right? The guy who first thought of it is Alvin Toffler, future shock, the guy who coined the phrase prosumer, who I interviewed, and he already was saying we could not keep up with technological developments. So once the atmosphere changed in the 60s and the early 70s, especially with the publication of Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, with the Malthusian computer analysis done by Forrester and Meadows, The Limits to Growth, with Victor Papanek in design and his ridiculous book, Design for the Real World, then we find a change in sentiment, particularly after the energy crisis. This is the head of OPEC, a Venezuelan, saying that oil was not gold, it was shit. So what we find is that the same thing can be regarded in entirely different ways depending on the climate in society. And it's quite interesting if you go a little further and you look at the theories of society. One has to collect them, one has to suspect them. You can see some of the big people there. The theories all changed and got a lot more pessimistic and a lot more focused on uncertainty after the end of the Cold War. When left and right disappeared as reasonable concepts, we saw a harbinger of what's happening in Britain today, where left and right don't mean much anymore. And we also saw rushing into the Blairite centre a whole nudgish consensus about how new issues that were not left and right, including green, including personal health care and lifestyle and so on, became the main focus for political debate. So if you look at what's been happening really since The Guardian 20 years ago said that you should all be dead from mad cow disease. Actually, you look quite lively this morning. These are all the things that you're supposed to have got worried about and did get worried about once the Cold War was over. ADHD is what you've got listening to me. DVT, deep vein thrombosis, long-haul flights, computer use at IPSOS. Endocrine disruptors, well, they're all around your kitchen and messing up your estrogen and all the rest of it. And one of the key ones that was mentioned, phthalates. Phthalates. Anybody know what phthalates are? Well, they're in this, and the EU, in its wisdom, has determined that if your rubber duck in a bath has phthalates in it, if you lick it for 200 years, you will become a laboratory rat. And the only thing about this is that life expectancy for 65-year-olds plus, like me, is actually still remarkably high in Britain. Apparently there's one or two setbacks. A few Scots have started smoking again. But generally speaking, we're healthier than ever. So how do we square all of the things, you know, red meat, roasts, puddings, avoid puddings. Anybody know about orthorexia? Obsessive eating of the right foods. It's a real problem. Isn't it? Nevertheless, we've never been healthier. We've never been taller and more Dutch. You know, they're going to have to redesign aeroplanes for us. So what we find is that the theories of the future become a little more biological and a little more to do with energy. And they very much reflect, as I say, this guy, the Donald. Now let's now turn back to plastics. And we see the economists picking up this trope of, oil, petrochemicals, plastics is shit. And we see also some brilliant professionals entering the world of forecasting. Not content with talking to plants, Mr. Charles believed in 2009 that we have 100 months to save the world. I fear that deadline has passed. We now learn that there's another 100 months to save the world. And that really, as I say, in our kitchens and elsewhere, plastics and cleaning fluids and nanomaterials, along with various other things we can't see, like Russian bots and other things, they're all over us. They're messing us up. Like artificial intelligence, according to The Guardian, they are everywhere. Did you know that? AI is everywhere. We can see it when we try to do this. So I want to say that if you look more closely at the issue of plastics, you'll see things like this on the internet, very famous now. more plastic than fish in the world's oceans. You get a chart like that. If you actually bother to go to the source, again, it's the World Economic Forum, that's the source, and what it's talking about is not how much plastics is in the oceans, it's talking about how much plastics production has gone on in the past, not about what the absorption of plastics in the future. It's part of a wider narrative that certainly deserves more inspection than it's getting at the moment. And that narrative is all about catastrophe. What began as climate change quickly becomes climate emergency, then climate catastrophe. And I resist all of this. I think it is fatalistic. I think it is pessimistic. I think it's misanthropic. And the most dangerous trope here is that Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. If any of you have lost, as I have, a relative to Auschwitz, you will resent that easy and glib equation. If any of you bother to know anything about China, you'll know it wasn't such a big deal in the 30s, but it is a big deal now. So to draw a parallel between Trump and Hitler is a historical disgrace, and yet it's very prevalent. But we're supposed to fear the future. We're supposed never to take risks like some great people have. And above all, we're supposed to set an example to the world because they hold us in such respect, given the last 3 years, around the world. And we're going to tell China and India what to do by demonstrating what to do ourselves. Now, in any other camp, that would be regarded as an imperialist plot for us to tell Indians, and no doubt Africans eventually, what they should and shouldn't do. But as long as the cause is just, then it's all right to lecture the East and the South about how to behave, because we can set an example. Actually, I think nationalism is pretty much dead in Britain. We can have a beer about that. But this is a species of nationalism that's very much alive. So let me just say that along with plastics and phthalates and all of these things, there's a whole lot of things that the liberal intelligentsia in London would like to ban. Artificial intelligence, because it's spooky, antibiotics, fossil fuels, are coming to that, fast food, genetically modified food, high speed 2. Anybody know, does IPSOS know, the average number of miles of main roads that Britain builds every year? You know, we're concreting over the southeast. How many miles of motorways and main roads each year? If you go to the statistics made by the Department for Transport, you'll find that it's 18 miles a year for a leading advanced economy, 18 miles. So we've got to ban new roads, we've got to ban runways, we've got to ban, with Sadiq Khan, unrealistic body images, and more we've got to ban a number of countries. You know, I think Hungary and Poland have been bubbling under for a bit, Israel, long-standing candidate for banning, and now Salvini in Italy. So my first thing to say to you is that in analysing plastics, in being a better IPSOS, it's important to understand the views that have been taken of plastics, the intellectual history of plastics, if you like. And secondly, in the light of all of this sort of hysteria, really, about plastics and everything else, where a 16-year-old can be admired by Michael Gove and Ed Miliband and Caroline Lucas for their wisdom and everything, it is important to distinguish real risks from perceived ones. Say you go on a plane, ladies and gentlemen, and you fail to switch off your mobile phone. It's upstairs in the luggage compartment. Are you going to crash? Or is it more likely that crap Boeing software is going to make you crash? I will tell you which is more likely, because I do believe that some of you have committed the appalling crime of leaving a mobile phone on in the luggage compartment. That is where real risk does not quite match with perceived risks. All right, well, let's have a look at plastics waste. How big is the problem? Let me say, the wonderful thing about rubbish and plastics is that it's rubbish. It's extremely difficult to classify and to quantify. It's in the nature of rubbish that it is all mixed up, and therefore it's hard to track. That's why the BBC runs these articles about how it's so confusing. And if you look at the different types of plastic, you know, where they're used, how they're used, what their abbreviations are, all the new ones that are being developed, it's really hard to track, all right? But you can track it if you go to the waste statistics of WRAP, W-R-A-P, which is the government's official program. And the first thing that you notice about those statistics is that the construction waste here, non-hazardous construction and demolition, in terms of the tons, is way bigger than the commercial and industrial, which is way bigger than households. This is waste in general, which is way bigger than plastic packaging waste, which is way bigger than plastics waste. That doesn't mean plastics waste isn't a problem, but it does give you some perspective on what's going on. And if you actually look at the numbers, what's quite remarkable is that the construction industry in Britain, a byword for progress and forward-moving dynamism, especially in housing, is actually very good at recycling its waste. It recycles more waste than is the EU target. I do know what I'm talking about because I did that book. Now, the more interesting thing is just how much our exports of waste, and plastics waste in particular, have been growing. And if you bother to look at the footnote, earlier this year, the NAO reported the plastics sent abroad could be highly contaminated, meaning it may not be reprocessed and could end up in landfill or contributing to pollution. So before we rush to recycle, we must remember that much of the recycling is being done by us exporting to China, until it banned it, thankfully, last year, and India and everywhere else. Then we make the targets because we say it's going to be recycled. And in fact, it's probably not going to be recycled in those places. We are dumping on them. So where is the problem with plastics? Is Britain really responsible for as much as people imagine? Is it responsible for as many carbon emissions as we imagine? Well, if you look at the numbers, and this is Science Advances, which is quite useful, they break down how plastics moves from production to recycling, incineration, discarded. And there's, just as you can see, very, very little is recycled at the moment. If you look at what's happening in recycling, it's still very costly. It's extremely energy intensive, labor intensive, water intensive. This is the genuine article, when it happens, which it doesn't much. And it's very hard to sort because it is rubbish, very hard to sort. So the cowboys are dominating, and meanwhile my 92-year-old mother every Sunday spends an hour meeting Merton Council packaging requirements. This is what she has to look at. This is what she has to interpret. I hope you're good at that, because I find it quite hard. This is what she has to read, right, to sort her rubbish. And that's progress, were it not for the fact that Merton Council mixes it all up in the dump anyway. So what I'm here to say is that although incineration gets a bad press, it might actually be worth looking into as an alternative, because it's a more controllable process, it's a more automatable process, and Sweden has actually shown that you can lower and lower and lower the level of pollution coming out of incineration. It's not ideal. I'm just saying, can we give it a moment before we all agree with the consensus? Now, we could have a look at landfill, which is also a problem. Are you telling me that in the 21st century we cannot capture and recycle the methane and make it into gas for our use? Now, if you look at what's happening with plastics waste, where is it concentrated? It's concentrated in Asia and in Africa. Here's a map of where it is, and with the exception of Latin America and Central America, it really is concentrated, as I say, in Asia and Africa. And in fact, nearly all of the plastics in the world and the waste in the world is coming out of 10 rivers. 8 are in Asia, beginning with the Yangtze. Also the Ganges is important. And 1 or 2 others like the Nile and so on are also implicated. So really what we're saying is that it's in the developing world with poor water management, poor refuse management, and poor economies, with the exception of China, that really the problem exists. And that's what needs to be sorted, and it can be sorted. How can we sort it? How can we find a cure? Well, there's different ways that we can deal with plastics. We could go to highly democratic Istanbul, where they've just decided to have a second people's vote. Did you know? Erdogan just decided that the vote went the wrong way, so he's going to have another vote. I wonder where we've heard that before. And you can therefore go to Istanbul and you can trade in your used plastics bottles for a rail fare on the Istanbul Underground. Or you can go more usefully to the world's rivers, as I said, and to the pipes that are around them, and you can bring in some sophisticated IT, or not so sophisticated, to prevent leaks and to prevent the stuff coming out of those pipes that fills the rivers and our beaches with this kind of detritus. So let's hear it for pipes, folks. You don't hear much about them. They're important to new housing. They're important to fossil fuels. They're important to water management. And then we can, without guilt-tripping people about did you or did you not dispose of that Starbucks cup, we can fix the problem with what Greens deride as a technological fix, what I used to know as a child as progress. So if you take a fellow Dutchman, Boyan Slat, he is trying to collect up the largely fishing net-based plastics waste in the oceans. And of course, he's been slagged off by Greens. Why? It can't work. It won't work. And even if it did work, it shouldn't work, because that would absolve you from the guilt that you should feel. I don't buy it. I believe that the main industry in Britain is that Victorian sector, guilt. And I'm not prepared to slag off Boyan Slat for trying to fix the problem in ways where we can actually read the newspaper rather than worry about the plastics in our hands. There are other ways of solving the problem. We could join MIT and others in building beach-based robots to clear it up. We can volunteer, as people do. Or we can go to Pakistan, where they've got a fungus that will eat PET. We can also check out the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where scientists have built a genetically modified enzyme that will also eat PET. And then we could perhaps join the French entrepreneur who's connected with Disneyland, who has trained crows to remove cigarette butts from the local park. But no, we must do none of this. You must understand that you are to blame for plastics waste, for killing fish everywhere, and that none of these solutions can, will, or should be allowed to work. So I'm nearly done. You're very kind to hang on for the same slides. Let me say that if you read the International Energy Agency about what's going to happen with petrochemicals and plastics, we're actually going to see a lot more of them. We're going to see a lot more of them in cars to save weight, in planes to save weight, in clothing, in digital devices and everywhere else. And it's a good thing. It lightens weight. It lowers the petrol emissions and the particulates and the CO2 emissions. And the problem that we got with plastics is that they're not being developed fast enough. And with carbon generally. Carbon is a miracle material. Any of you want a zero carbon world in 2030? Hands up. And don't be nice just because I'm having a go at all this stuff. I'm sure many of you do. It means suicide, ladies and gentlemen, because 18% of you is carbon. Now, I recently made this point on Sky TV, and 100 Greens rushed in saying, this is very disturbing. A professor of forecasting and innovation believes climate change is to do with exhaling. Yeah, that's right. You know, I read the science, and that's what I believe. But in fact, carbon gets a terrible press. It's terrific. Problem with it is that we're not recycling it on an industrial scale, and we are fidgeting with it, but not really developing it. So here's somebody who's developed a radiator for your house. It's that thick because of the conductive qualities of graphene. After 2 Russians worked out how to manufacture it in 2004, we've done nothing about this. Where are these radiators that would save space and allow you to live in a slightly larger hovel in London where you could swing a cat or half a cat? And we know that there's graphene in clothing made by Cute Circuit and so on. They got graphene displays to do what you and I do on Tinder, but on your chest. And it's, you know, really something. We're not getting any of it. So we can do a bit of research. Development, however, appears to be beyond our friends in power at the moment. So for a very long time to come, I'm here to say that hydrocarbons are a force for progress, and if you would like to discuss in the lunch I was promised, but the forecasting proved incorrect, if you would like to discuss the power density of a normal electric battery versus that of an internal combustion engine, I'd be delighted to discuss that with you, unless there's a major breakthrough, the technological disruption of my sort, not Clayton Christensen's sort. We will be very much confined to ICE for a long time to come. So I'm nearly done. I want to say that I mentioned prototypes, I mentioned experiments. Those things, which are so much abhorred nowadays as risky, are essential to predicting the future and to testing one's theories. Not just me that's saying that, it's the Harvard Business Review, where they make the point that businesses, and maybe even IPSOS, don't do enough small pilots from which you can learn stuff from your mistakes. I recommend it to you in forecasting, with your people you're polling, with new business units, with new technologies that work straight off the bat. Let's prototype, let's pilot, let's mess it up, because that's how we can move forward. So my time is up, the 5 o'clock shadow is in, and in case any of you want to troll me, which I very much welcome, if you can learn how to, was it something I said? Oh, magic. That's quick. Yeah, I'd be delighted if you would troll me and have a look at the website. Out of combat, ladies and gentlemen, which I'm sure we're now going to have, out of heat can come light, you know? And I would also urge you, next time, there won't be a next time for me, but the next time you organise discussion, maybe have adversaries. First for the motion, first against the motion. Second for, second against. The public appetite for debate and for a challenge to the teenage wisdom that now counts as good coin around the world is quite remarkable. You'll get double this audience, even on a Friday afternoon, and a set 2 can actually be revealing. Thank you so much for staying with me.